Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining this webinar. I'm Geraldine Cross from IATA in the headquarters in Montreal, Canada. Before we start, I would like to give you a few information. This session is recorded and we will share the recording with our attendees. All the microphones are muted, but that doesn't mean that you're completely silenced. You can ask us questions in the right side of your screen. You will have a box for that. Don't hesitate to send us some question and we'll try to address as much as we can during the Q&A session after the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, John Synnott. He will introduce us, our speakers today. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Geraldine. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. Okay, let's get this started. In this webinar, we want to strike a strategic instead of technology-driven picture for the industry's possible emergence or trajectory out of this present pandemic we call COVID-19. As you'll hear, we'll wander through the digitization, or what it is in fact and where we're going. The right tech terminology, or are we hung up with buzzwords? We want to illustrate that it's the business and it's the ecosystem process coupled with smart integrated data that will be the platform upon which the next generation of integrated, intelligent, and industry-level business systems must evolve. Of course, this perspective does not ignore technology. It merely puts into place and restores the order of things. Before we get moving, let's take over some housekeeping items. As we mentioned before, this will be recorded. It'll be available in a couple of days for review, and for those who have missed the opportunity to watch it live. But also, everyone is muted, so speakers got a clear path. We encourage questions. The more the better, but we probably will not get to all of them if we get a view each. We've also included the contact details on our introduction screen for those who wish to get in touch after. If we don't have time to go to, as I mentioned before, if we don't have time to get to questions, we'll be reviewing in the next couple of days. Please be aware the webinar panel will discuss these individually, and the top 10 will be published in our newsletter to all registered participants in the days after following the event. Okay, so COVID isn't the only environment we live in, and I'm bound to point out that we're obliged to the guidelines here. Please be mindful of them when you're submitting your questions. With that, let's get going. This webinar is brought to you by IATA Safety and Flight Operations and Closed Loop Consulting. For those who don't know them, Closed Loop is a global group specializing in strategic operational programs for airlines and associated operationally connected segments, like airports and other interconnected supply chains. Their capability includes data integration, holistic system design, and project delivery, as well as high-level board and senior management assurance programs. Closed Loop has left its footprint on the industry, and with a few airlines over the last 11 years or so, we've had the privilege, and I underline that word, to have them here today. Okay. Now, for the industry to successfully emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, doing things the same old way just will not do. While unrelenting attention to balance sheets and finances by enterprise CEOs will be an accepted norm for these things in these times, we cannot ignore a once-in-a-generation opportunity to design the entire journey ecosystem, and with it, maybe the industry too. Now is the time to build and evolve strategies, objectives, and plans to reshape the industry, the airlines, and build system efficiencies and readiness for a future that will be very different, but also eerily familiar. So my name is John Synnott. I'll be moderating today's event and trying to keep our speakers on topic, given the range of subjects for tonight, this morning, or this afternoon's episode that it should cover. My position within IATA is the Manager of Flight Operations Information Technology. I'm Secretary to the Aircraft Performance Technical Group, which includes standard computerized aircraft performance, digital aircraft data exchange, and various elements of SWIM, ETOD, and specifically with ETOD and AMDB. Marcus Carr, one of our speakers, is a principal of Flow Group, director of projects, and a subject matter expert for digital data and data integration. Marcus' 30 years of experience ranges across projects, dealing with complex data sets covering civilian and military aviation, legislation, mortgage lending, telecom, drug and medical data, case law, technology, and almost everything in between. Knowledge of data system has been fundamental to Marcus' success in project management. He has spoken at numerous conferences, particularly dealing with delivery of critical data sets in time-critical projects. Marcus is a Prince 2 practitioner and a firm believer that project management is a human task, not a software function. Captain Mike Bryan is recently retired long-haul captain with over 44 years and almost 25,000 hours of aeronautical experience across airlines, business, and general aviation and training. Mike flew the A380 for a decade into his retirement and has flown 10 years on the 747-400 long-haul ops and another 10 on the Boeing 767 on a mix of long and short-haul ops. During his career, Mike has chaired the Digital Data Committee, helping to bring SGML into the industry landscape, and also sitting on a number of ELS committees, as the EFB was known back then, as far back as 1988. He sat on the late 2000 Pedal 2 committee, and as a consequence of that work, became a member with Boeing on the initial FANS ATN committee. Mike was a member of the flight technical team at Qantas and held supervisory roles over his almost 34 years with the airline. Mike has a master's in aviation management, holds a diploma in electronic engineering, and is a Prince 2 practitioner, certified with the Office of the Government of Commerce in the UK. Between Mike and Marcus, this is going to be an interesting and wide open conversation. So Marcus, let's get up and at it. Your turn, my friend.
Hey everybody, whatever time zone you might be in. So to start formulating a strategic approach for a post-COVID industry, we really need to first look at the general strategic direction that airlines were taking pre-COVID. Razor-thin margins averaging 3% and increasingly tenuous hold on market share made for a fundamentally unsustainable business model. Continuing to run those two factors ultimately results in airlines that are unprofitable and too risky to operate. According to IATA's own economics, almost 70% of airlines were already in survival mode going into COVID. It's critically important to recognize this. If we don't, the strategy of airlines post-COVID will be to transition from current catastrophe back into survival mode. We just can't do that. So the KT event about 65 million years ago was a catalyst for significant evolutionary change, leading to the dominance of mammals that persists today. In the face of wildly varying predictions about when the industry will regain its 2019 highs and continue the trajectory it was on, our challenge today is to recognize that COVID is an evolutionary event for the aviation industry. We're provided with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to recast the industry using the benefit of decades of hindsight. Every airline on the planet is being forced to reimagine itself at the same moment in time. It's never happened before, and it may never happen again. And most of us hope it'll never happen again, which makes it even more critical that we make use of this opportunity. So over the course of the next few minutes, we're going to look at three main areas where airline strategy isn't currently working. The first is that airlines can't or don't cooperate with each other. Airlines can't engage meaningfully with industry initiative, and that's not necessarily even their problem. And the third is that airlines can't provide strategic direction to departmental projects. Now, this sounds like a lot of planning, but actually that's not the case. Well, as you'll see in a moment. But the three are very much connected to each other, which ironically makes them easier to address. So let's start with inter-airline cooperation. The details of the strategic approach of airlines are hard to nail down, and we only have an hour. So let's consider survival strategy in a simpler scenario. You and one other person are shipwrecked on a desert island with available but scarce resources. The first 5 days you spend waiting on the beach for a rescue plane, and when none arrive, you're forced to consider your survival. Chances are you're both going to independently arrive at the same three strategies, with the first and the most obvious being to work cooperatively with each other. So resources may be scarce, but engaging in collective activities such as building a fish trap may make them more available for both of you. Most people would see this as being the obvious approach. The second, and perhaps a little less palatable, would be to eliminate the competition. So while that doesn't improve the resource availability, it does increase your share. Doing so limits the potential for you to improve your overall situation, but who knows what goes through people's heads. And the third strategy that you might come up with is to hope that the other one starves first and that you're still capable of accessing resources. So for those unwilling to work cooperatively and unable to eliminate the competition, this may be the only alternative, but it's by far the weakest strategy. Nonetheless, the airline industry is best characterized by cutting expenses and margins, then hoping to outlast the competition. We keep hearing about how important it is for industry partners to work cooperatively to ensure a smooth restart, but those are mostly just motherhood statements without much substance. COVID hasn't just been a massive disruption, it's been a shipwreck. And we're coming up on day 5. So what are we going to do? Surely not the same thing again. We're not just going to lie on the beach eyeing each other off again, are we? So we know airlines don't cooperate with each other strategically, even though it would make sense to do so. The second failing is inability to engage with industry initiatives. So let's look at how airlines conduct themselves with a broader industry, not just their competitors. There are many excellent and well-crafted industry initiatives that an airline could feed into its strategy, but it's really not that simple to do it. Strategic adoption of even the most sound industry initiative carries a risk to the airline. That risk is higher when the airline has no knowledge of how the initiative might be regarded by other airlines. Information about the general strategic roadmap of an airline does not compromise its competitive advantage. That's a very important point. Information about the general strategic roadmap of an airline does not compromise its competitive advantage. A number of years ago, I participated in an industry initiative here in Australia where major banks were compelled to set aside their misconceptions about the competitive advantage. They did it and revolutionized the residential mortgage industry to the advantage of their customers as well as themselves. All of them, everyone benefited. The bottom line is that every airline that considers an industry initiative does so in an information vacuum. So strategic objectives are incomplete, adoption is tentative, and risk is higher than it should be, putting everybody on edge. Everybody just crosses their fingers and holds their breath because better mechanisms just don't exist. There simply isn't enough industry context around the initiatives to properly inform the airline strategy. And that's neither the fault of the initiatives or the airlines. So that leads us to the third failing of airline strategy, And this one they do have a bit more control over, the inability to provide direction to airline projects. It's not surprising. If airlines aren't willing to share opinions about the merits of industry initiatives, how could strategy emerging from that isolated perspective result in anything of benefit to the project teams? An airline's strategic objective may be no more detailed than we intend to have an operational EFB program across the fleet in the next 5 to 7 years. No details, no impact analysis on the rest of the organization, and no positioning of the program in the longer-term roadmap of the airline. Why? They don't have that information. The confusion is amplified when someone on a project becomes aware of an industry initiative and takes their business unit off at a tangent without the knowledge of the rest of the airline. Of course, that should never happen, but in the absence of comprehensive strategy provided by the airline, it's pretty much inevitable. That initiative then becomes part of the de facto strategy of the airline. So think about that for a moment. The airline strategy is being formed by a departmental project adopting an unsanctioned industry initiative. I defy you to come up with a more backwards approach to strategy formulation than that. So this is the current approach to strategy. The airline does its best, but it can only loosely draw from a pool of disconnected and unprioritized industry initiatives, resulting in a strategy that lacks clarity and fails to properly account for risk. Recognizing this, the departmental project can draw little of real use. What typically happens at this point is that an application is purchased and the features provided by the technology form a pseudo strategy. Soon after, the cracks start appearing at the system level, with processes being particularly vulnerable to this, and they often need to be adjusted. The end result is that the program delivers only part of what it needed to, and what it does deliver is out of step with other departmental projects. So while the project may not contradict the corporate strategy, there's no way of evaluating whether it supports it. So let's step back a bit and apply another simplified approach by defining a strategy as a collective of systems producing planned outcomes. An outcome from the strategy on the desert island might involve always having 2 days of boiled water stored. Like virtually every system, this one relies on information, process, and technology. The information involves knowing where a source of fresh water exists. The first process is to relocate the water from the source to the campfire. The technology is to stoke the fire to ensure adequate heat for disinfection. So of course, there are other processes, placing the water over the fire in an appropriate container, but most of this system might be broken down to finer granularity. You get the idea though. There's a misconception within the airline industry though, that technology is the same thing as a system. And this causes massive misalignment between programs and strategy. Airline people flock to conferences to check out technology that might be applied to their programs, virtually making up a shopping list. Their criteria includes, does it satisfy my project requirements? Has it worked for other airlines? Does it satisfy my user expectations? Is it the coolest and the latest, etc.? What they're far less likely to be evaluating against is what organizational strategic outcomes would this fulfill? So is that their fault? Well, it depends. If the corporate strategy provides details of what's required or expected, and the project team pays them no heed, it's the fault of the project team. Otherwise, it's the fault of the strategy. The strategy needs to clearly convey detailed, immediate objectives as well as longer-term ones. When discussing technology with suppliers, the project team should be equipped to ask questions along the lines of, in 3 years, we want to incorporate data from Initiative X into our system. Are you currently working towards support for Initiative X? Can you explain your approach? Without access to the knowledge that the airline at least provisionally intends to adopt Initiative X, the project people just can't ask those questions. So it's the fault of the corporate strategy? No, not necessarily. The airline can't and shouldn't make decisions about Initiative X in a vacuum. In 3 years, Initiative X may have been overtaken by other developments and been long since relegated to the scrap heap. Without the context of where Initiative X is going to fit into the bigger picture and how much industry momentum is behind it, it's too risky to identify as a strategic outcome. It's bad business to saddle a program worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars with strategic outcomes that are never going to materialize. The buck has to stop somewhere though, and at the moment it stops with the airline's strategy. Technologies driving systems which are shaped into substandard departmental programs. Disparate departmental programs contribute to a loose and reactive airline strategy that's isolated from the rest of the industry. And the result is silos.
So looking at Marcus' illustrations and amplifying the airline perspective, it looks a bit like this: multiple bottom-up initiatives restrained by departmental barriers. EFB was a project like this. I can remember spending too much of my downtime filing and trying to assimilate pages of revisions, just knowing an EFB would make it easier. But was it better, really? And how's that measured anyway? Projects grow for the most part within departmental boundaries and often competitively so. This is another drag on efficiency, but the detail would have us here for the rest of the day. Information rarely passes between the departments, and resource and energy sapping infighting over project ownership and benefit allocation has far-reaching effects. By way of example, the highest yielding EFB project of all time that we're aware of had a net present value in 9 figures, but was trashed because the engineering department felt they should own it rather than flight ops. After all, the project involved things being bolted on the aeroplane. It took more than a decade before the airline's EFB was realised. After years, more investigation, conferences, and false starts. We'll get to net present value in a minute. While the strategic connection discussed by Marcus could have positive effects on the picture here, the reason for digging into the airline side of the industry's turf and strategy malaise is this. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, said, "You have to know the past to understand the present." We think as an industry, we need to know the past to change direction into the future. We call this zero basing, starting with a clean sheet, but basing the design on the knowledge of decades. So unlike accountants, we think past performance is a basis for future direction. And like many other philosophers, we've summed up the last few slides into our law of 4, 2, and a half, where the cost of the industry's efficiency effort becomes apparent. A few years ago, Sachs Consulting and more recently BCG calculated the real cost of airline technology projects. We've repackaged their data to drive home the point. The data delivers a harsh assessment of the results of projects in the operational segment of the industry. What's not here is that airlines consider only about 8% of their projects to be entirely successful. Don't be shocked. The airline industry is not on top of the naughty list. The airline industry has some of the brightest people in the world in its family. So why are these statistics so stark? Well, we think it's because there's a fundamental problem with the way the industry goes about projects, and it's got a lot to do with what Marcus was talking about. While this is a more recent statistic, I think everyone's getting the idea that we believe the industry's approach to strategy could do with a bit more attention. The fragmented structure of airlines, which carries into the bodies that run the industry, also fragments the industry strategy, as Marcus illustrated. That's if initiatives can really be called strategy. Here are a few examples. How's your organisation? The Harvard Business Review is as hard on strategic aspects as SACS and BCG were about operational projects. It turns out that we haven't been doing strategy for decades. What's passed for strategy is the catchy statements we're all used to hearing. Can you think of yours? While the corporate comms department thinks they're doing a great job with jingles, the rest of the organisation is left to figure out their own. They, in turn, come up with catchphrases that trip them up. The departmental strategy of more than a few flight operations departments around the world includes saving fuel at all costs. What does that mean? Especially the all costs bit. We could chat about that, and we have with some airlines, for hours. The challenges of good strategy run deep and the costs are high. We'll come back to strategy, but we need to look at another specific COVID focus for airlines. This is nothing new. A CEO's focus on the balance sheet and other related financial stuff is important at any time, but now it's more critical than ever. When we go cap in hand to the finance to get finance for the latest, greatest gadget for the airline, most of us had to answer some tough questions. They have greater emphasis now. This will be focused for a while because we're not hearing CEOs talk about anything else lately, and there's good reason. For many on this webinar, it'll also mean the so-called straight line cost benefit analysis will be a thing of the past. The discounted cash flow will decide the fate of projects from here on. Why is that important? Well, we don't want to go into accounting principles, but it's essential to get an idea of what CEOs will be interested in. And this is what they talk about now, often. The industry's value has plummeted. A liquidity crisis, no news, caused by spending on leases, debt, wages, and other fixed costs while the aircraft sit on the ground, has evaporated cash to dangerous levels. In the short term, you may see a focus on earnings reporting at the expense of value creation, weighing strategic decisions against the impact on reportable earnings instead of, perhaps, a counterintuitive consideration of the value of future cash flow generated by intelligent strategy and deft implementation. The first is a short-term approach that might pay off, but put longer-term survival in jeopardy. The second approach focuses on the long-term viability of the organisation and regrowing corporate value. We'll have to help our bosses tread a delicate balance between the two. The levers that would be pulled, the tools that would typically be applied, are of little use when everyone is in the same boat or the plane. We can't sell assets to raise liquidity because no one wants them. Liquidity is a critical aspect of financing. It puts us in the position where those holding our financial support can start pulling the strings or walk away, taking the rug out from under us as they go. We'll find it harder to secure financing when we need it in the future. But there are still a couple of levers to pull. Arrangements with suppliers and creditors are an obvious start. We suspect that airline CEOs have already pulled this one hard. Have a look at lease pricing, for example. The industry is also not benefiting from nearly the lowest fuel prices in decades because we're not flying. Without passengers to fly, fuel price doesn't matter much. Airlines are already making arrangements with customers. There have been travel vouchers, but airlines are going further, offering low fares to drive demand. In areas of the globe where travel is possible, and in a few domestic networks, this is having some effect, but not as much as hoped. A glance at the OAG indicates the false starts in a few places. Too many webinars to count over the pandemic have pointed out the abundance of caution on the demand side. Of course, there's pent-up demand. People haven't seen each other for most of the year. But when the initial rush blows off, what then? Well, here's a novel idea. Let's keep more of what we earn. Suffice to say, we're not talking about cost cutting here. We've got to develop and choose projects that add value to the company. Speaking to CEOs and CFOs out there, what we're talking about here is significantly reducing the cost of operations by investing in cost efficiencies that will improve your long-term forecast income. Projects that will improve forward NPVs, meaning there'll be less chance of having to book all of those impairment charges. As we said, in the current liquidity crisis, it might seem counterintuitive, but in the light of everything else, what's left? Projects will impact organisation structures as well as systems and processes and the different technology enablers that go with it. It'll mean new business methods and competitive differentiation based on different things, if you're game. First though, we've got to understand how the way we've chased efficiency over the years has worked for us, or hasn't, and channel Carl Sagan again by looking back to develop the future. Based on the registrations, here's a likely favourite for a few of you. The EFB was invented in the late 1980s. I'll bet not many know that. It was called something else, but I digress. The first EFB entered service with FedEx around 1994. What many won't know is that the FedEx EFB was connected. Sure, it was the first go, but it delivered on expectations in function and finance. It's been a tortured path for EFB since then, and I'll bet most of our audience disagrees with that. Let me elaborate. In 2016, Markets and Markets published a report claiming that the global EFB market would be worth over $5 billion in 2020. Oops. Now a June 2020 report from the industry research company notes that the global EFB market is only worth a shade over $2 billion, but of course it's forecast to be worth over $6 billion by 2026. I'll take money against that too. There is an interesting point about these numbers. They're what it's worth to the supply side. What's it worth to airlines? No one's disputing its utility. We all love it. But Closed Loop finds it fascinating that not many airlines can or will tell you what its real value, its present value, those forward value-adding cash flows that increase the value of the airline are. Why is that? What we do know is, depending on the project, the real value of EFB varies between 9 figures, yes, that's over 100 million, to -8 figures, and yes, that's over 10, -40 million in the case we're talking about. We know big airlines that started with EFB project values a bit over 2 million, but have since gone backwards by several times that amount. We also know smaller airlines that delivered north of 10 million in annual savings. What's yours? It's okay if you don't really know, not many do, and we understand why. We'll leave EFB with this teaser. How long was your EFB project from the time it was first mentioned until it was part of normal operations? Does anyone want to have a crack at the industry average? Then there's fuel. While no one wants to cast any doubt on the importance of fuel-saving programs, let's be frank. Do we all agree the low-hanging fruit is gone? We don't. But the alternate theory is hard to ignore. Check this out. What's missing? Let me say at the outset that we're not anti-fuel saving. I mean, look at these numbers, courtesy of one of the fuel-saving companies. They're eye-watering. It was on their website, so I'm going to declare public domain, but I'm not going to say who it was. We did update the example to reflect the current fuel price, but still, that figure in the bottom right is convincing. Except it's not real. Does anyone know which airline has 4,000 flights a day? There was one that was about that before the virus broke the industry, but 1,000 kilograms per flight? Come on. What this chart does demonstrate is the power of multiplication, not much else. What's missing is what work had to be done. What was the effort that saved that kilogram of fuel per flight? What about the 50 and so on? How much did that change actually cost? Spreadsheet projections are great. Here are some facts. Because of scarcity, these are the real figures for one airline on one of its routes. This is the average holding fuel used for arrivals into one destination. Sometimes it was more. There were 4 flights per day, all copping it, and this wasn't the only port with excessive holding in this network. Oh, and that 8 tonnes had to be carried for about 12 hours. The holding fuel blown out the tailpipe in a week was more than the airline saved in a year from all its other fuel saving initiatives. This airline isn't unique, so one wonders, are we looking in the wrong direction? Here's another program. This one scratched around declaring about 100 or 200 kilogram savings on a 12-hour flight, with a departure upload close to 200 tonnes. Apart from being difficult to measure, except on a spreadsheet, the administrative and communications input costs required to achieve the $50 saving was often hundreds. But the fuel was saved, and that's the point, right? Remember, saving fuel at all costs? We'll come back to this. What about the environmental impact? Fuel saving programs demonstrate huge savings of CO2. Let's take a practical example. Saving 30 kilos a flight in an airline with a more realistic schedule of, say, 200 flights a day saves more than 6 million kilograms of CO2 every year. A recent IATA report states that the industry collectively generated 914 million tonnes of CO2 in 2019. Let's get a bit utilitarian. Such savings are a fraction of a percent of the industry's emissions. Until the virus smashed into us, there was a long way to go to get to the targets the industry had set for itself, with a substantial and looming cost. But there's a huge opportunity too. A 2017 NASA study about the industry's, quote, dirty little secret, end quote, notes that the airline industry's generation of contrails has had more effect on global warming than, quote, all the CO2 that aircraft have emitted since the Wright brothers flew in 1903, end quote. Tackling contrails was discussed at Heathrow's Big Green Day in 2010, and we've been able to fix it since then. But we, the industry, hasn't. Begs the question, what are we really trying to achieve? How efficient are our efficiency programs? Trajectory-based operations, TBO for short, is the new kid on the block. It's been advanced by ICAO and picked up by most ANSPs to deal with the growing system disruption caused by capacity constraint across the board. It's a bold undertaking that effectively re-engineers the operational side of the industry. ANSPs almost have their ducks in a row, but the airline side is dragging the chain. Remember what we just said about the holding fuel. Imagine if that was a thing of the past. That is TBO. More later. While the annual cost of global system delays pales into insignificance in the current environment, every commentator on the planet thinks everything will be back to where it was in a few years. What then? Well, then we'll be lamenting the increasing cost of system delays, delays which we have an opportunity to correct now. There is some breathing space before, to quote Marcus, heading back into survival mode. 3% margins in a good year aren't sustainable, as if they ever were. It's even starker. IATA reported December last that the relatively good performance of the industry last year was delivered by only 30 airlines globally, with everyone else struggling. While we know everyone is hoping it will all come back as fast as it stopped, it won't. Like the hard lockdowns we've experienced around the world, we think a hard reset, A recast or recalibration, if you like, albeit an engineered one, is what the industry needs. John said earlier, the same old ways won't work as we climb out of this thing. Without effort, it's likely the industry will come out of this year being a mirror image of what it was, but a bit smaller and with the same problems. Would that be smart? Having the knowledge of decades as a basis on which we recast the industry, imagine what we could achieve. It will come back and we need to be ready for it, and we've got a vaccine-driven window to get it done. Once the vaccine is on the street, it'll be too late to engineer change. The urgency will be gone and will be run over in the rush to go back to what was. So what might it look like to get there? Well, we need to accept where things are now. A frame of reference, if you like, that we've been discussing so far. It's not a spelling mistake. We hear a lot about digitisation and why it's the latest panacea for everything. EFB was like that. But have we gone off at a tangent here again? We all get excited about great new buzzwords that come and go before we've got a handle on what they mean to all of us. Who remembers e-enablement? Let's get straight into it and deal with digitalisation quickly. Quite a few of the webinars over the COVID period tell us how our aging system backbones don't lend themselves to digitisation, and that wholesale upgrade and replacement will be required to move the industry to a digital world. Poppycock. Digitisation is a step in the digital transformation process for sure, but the industry has been evolving in that direction for years. Digitisation, in the broadest sense possible, is not much more than getting page-based information into digital form. Scanning paper and saving it as a PDF qualifies. Really, it does. Our old mainframe backbones are full of data and are much better than PDFs at processing it and making it available. Just because we've got petabytes of digital data doesn't confer digital transformation, but we've got a great foundation. No, wholesale upgrade and replacement of new systems aren't needed. Capability and technology exist to plug in and get moving relatively expensively if we get the strategy and execution right. Digitisation, actually digitalisation, can be done quickly and inexpensively. Another thing we hear a lot is that big data has to come before digitisation. Actually, no. Data's already big. More data doesn't matter to a digitalised system. Knowing what we want to do with it ahead of time does. What we're not doing well is integrating the big amounts of data we have into systems and processes that leverage it well. Does anyone know how many big data projects have been considered successful so far? It's not a pleasing number, considering how much the industry has invested in it. We like this one. It gets us into deep conversations with IT traditionalists, many of whom suggest everything must be carefully planned for and then insist we all go agile. Seriously though, the suggestion that for digitalisation, leveraging digital to work, everything must be expressed properly and exist in structured data systems like the databases of old is no longer true. The ability to work with and extract high value from unstructured and unrelated data is common. Data or information and the relationships between them are powerful tools, and the future will be built on them. Digitalisation and digitisation aren't the same. One is a step to the other. The value is the former. Both terms are components of a digital transformation program. We're really talking about data and what we can do with it. Let's not start conflating these or suggesting it's difficult and expensive. The capability has been around for so long, we're surprised the industry is not more advanced. The impact can be profound on the airline industry. Digital transformation programs can be modular, inexpensive, and powerful. When Closed Loop is asked to evaluate or frame digital transformation programs, we spend time with our clients, helping them understand the why test. Being able to explain why tends to uncover the nuances that lead to successful outcomes, or in some cases, sends them back to the drawing board. We did a session with an LCC a while ago. Executives flew in from overseas and domestic ports. A couple of IT specialists were there and a data analyst with doctor in his title. It was a top-heavy meeting, but no users. They explained everyone was using individual spreadsheets to collect data and generate reports that were stuck within the carpeted office dividers of the organisation. No one knew who had what and just how much duplication was occurring. No one could know the data's potential value or the intelligence it could provide. You'd have to say this was a pretty reasonable problem statement. They explained that their project's sole purpose, however, was to justify the purchase of Tableau, a data visualization software. A great solution, but to a different problem. And another example of spinning the wheels of efficiency programs without getting anywhere. Digital transformation is anything but the latest software craze. A recent BT survey said 75% of CEOs have digital strategies, but the rest of the organisation doesn't know and understand how these, but when the rest of the organisation doesn't know and understand how these connect, failures occur. An executive idea is one thing, but operationalising it is quite another. If the great initiative is not extended to business operations and systems, the outcome is likely to fit a McKinsey report from 2018 that suggests failures of digitisation programs run at more than 80%. From what we've been saying, I think this statement would be expected. Before you start, know what you're doing. Structure your program from the top down and the bottom up and get going. Digitisation will provide you with access to a lot of value. It'll provide you with actionable intelligence, the implication being someone will need to act. These are called Sankey diagrams, and these are based on unstructured data. The pictures they provide are indicative, but you can see the power of relationships. The potential is endless. We've talked a lot about strategy, how it seems to be misconstrued by the industry, and the problems we have with projects. Marcus illustrated the silos at an industry level, and I spoke of how that manifests in airlines and the raw cost of it. There's a lot of comment about how the industry climbs out of the COVID crisis. Governments and regulators have released ideas about what needs to be considered. They're all good initiatives. What's missing apart from the detail? If we really want to make a lasting difference, we've got to make some changes. The thing is, none of them is hard, just different. There's no room here to capture everything that's floating about in the industry. What we're trying to illustrate is that important yet essential programs are disconnected initiatives, and they're being advanced by a lot of committees that, except for a couple, are developing their concepts in total separation from the others. We think instead of waves of 3- and 4-letter acronyms and snappy catchphrases, we need a strategic plan for the industry, and one from which the airlines may draw into the development of their own. There are a couple of things about a strategic plan though. Most importantly, plan infers execution and outcomes. Then it has to be operationalized throughout the industry. We design all our client projects around these basic fundamentals, connecting departmental initiatives to the airline strategy and helping airlines develop strategic plans that provide context to the rest of the organisation. We think the simple answer is to re-engineer the industry. Our system discussion earlier was key in that we think a re-engineered industry, in what we think a re-engineered industry might look like. Each layer responsible for aligning and bounding its initiatives, but supporting the next layer in a recast industry ecosystem. There are a lot of initiatives here and a few key to a future vision of the industry, but some are mostly unheard of. We pop quizzed an industry conference last year, and in a room of over 350 people, only one person had heard of FFICE. The industry strategic plan will encapsulate and support the airline plan. and the airline departments will take their lead from there. Easy to draw, how easy to do? IATA's stated mission is to represent, lead and serve the airline industry. Our take in the midst of COVID rearranges it a bit, putting lead first. IATA's best placed to develop and provide the impetus for a global airline strategic plan. Its place within the structure of the industry puts it in the sweet spot between industry regulator and the airlines. But IATA will need to evolve and shift some of its focus. IATA leadership will need to decide whether it sees IATA in a tighter industry leadership role or whether it should leave the industry to struggle on as it was before the COVID crisis. Like we said, strategic plan and all the bits, easy. The decision to radically change direction, not so. In the end, our vision is something like this: an industry re-engineered with airlines being served by a developing thread of enabling systems, each relevant and complementary to the other. Airline departments have a clear objective in terms of their own systematic requirements. Smartly designed ecosystems evolve throughout the airline and the industry, and where appropriate, into other airlines, like swim data, providing a digitalised currency for efficiency, saving, and significant cost avoidance, giving back just a bit more to those margins. Airlines would find different ways to build competitive tensions and advantages. Because of the ubiquitous digital environment, many will evolve from different applications of information to the customer journey ecosystem. And with the additional layers of hurdles in front of our customers' journeys as we come out of this thing, every aspect of the journey will be up for grabs. The journey will be the new competitive differentiator. Coming out of this thing better than when we went in won't just be because we're smaller. It has to be based on something different. Financially, the industry has complained about its ability to make money predictably for decades. It's conceived of many programs to try and build more and more layers of efficiency, but most have taken years to realise little. We think a true system and digital transformation throughout the industry is the panacea for the future. Perhaps it's visionary, but without a vision, where are we going? Our old worldviews need to change quickly. I remember one of my bosses reminding us all that it was, quote, their train set, end of quote, referring to the company when he was making a point about how the airplanes would be operated and how we'd behave as employees. He was a great guy, but I wonder if he was consciously or otherwise conjuring up the initial railways model for the fledgling aviation industry. It has no place today. We think we need to look higher and model ourselves on the future, not the past. And we can rebuild the industry with the journey. Instead of layers, we can build integrated journeys from the point of the initial search to the airport, through airports that become part of the journey experience and into the modern flight. Facilitation will draw on the same free-flowing integrated data, smoothing the journey at all points and beyond. This will deliver an interactive and proactive future that optimizes the opportunities we have in the recovery based on integrated, digitalized ecosystems with integrated data as its currency. Whatever we do to enhance and assure the journey, demand will flow sooner, and the sooner we're back on the trajectory we were on before this event, the better. We'll leave the last slide to speak for itself. So I think it's time for John to get into some questions.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Marcus. I have a few questions here. First one has to do with silos and this turf war. So basically, from your experience, how are we to manage? Fascinating points being made here, but the fact remains: how do we manage a siloed heavy environment? So from your experience, can you touch on that a little bit? And we have a few more. And this probably ties into TBO as well. If we manage an enterprise that is heavily siloed, and then we bring in the A&SP side to work as a team to manage this airspace, how would you see the communications and the cooperation platform work?
Okay, I'll start with the silos. I think, you know, while there was a lot in the presentation, we covered the silo aspect in terms of strategies. You know, the airline industry has been built on functional roles since it began. What we tend to do is reinforce that. Pilots do what they do, dispatchers do what they do, dispatchers need their bit, you know, the load controller does something else. If airline strategies were more than, and industry strategies, if industry strategies and airline strategies were more than catchphrases, and you know, we don't really want to mention any in particular, that actually had the word plan and the execution that went along with those, I think we'd be able to manage the silo aspects a lot better than we do. Part of the reason that silos are so you know, reinforced as they tend to be in airlines is because you know, they're measured on KPIs that stay within inside the department, not KPIs that drive the whole organisation a lot of the time. Managers are rewarded in the same way. We think proper strategy and proper strategic plans would actually break that down, because to deliver on those things, everybody would know what their role would be. Everybody would be pulling in the same direction. I'm just not quite sure. Can you just repeat the question about TBO? I was sort of scribbling notes about the first one.
So just the bit about silos, and then to extend that into TBO, and now interfacing with the ANSPs on managing the airspace. How would we work that cooperation for the benefit of both parties? Right.
I think it all revolves around the industry having a plan. At the moment, there are industry committees that, like yours, that do performance. There are industry committees that weren't even on my list, like the Air Inc. industry activities work that they've done with electronic flight bag for a number of years. There are committees within the CANSO that are working, you know, hard and fast toward a TBO type environment, you know, growing in that direction with things like FFICE, etc. I think some sort of plan at the top, we'll call it a strategic plan, where that's devolved into all of the relevant and required and necessary industry participants to set some direction, would help that outcome a lot. TBO has been talked about for quite a few years, and it's been subtly pushed back. I mean, I don't know how many people are aware it was even coming, but originally it was due to be floating around in 2032, I think, 2028, sorry, fully implemented. Now it's been pushed out 4 years or so. The pandemic will push it out even further because of the levels of traffic that it was designed to fix not being there. But I think the way to get it moving is for a group sponsored by an organisation like IATA to actually start getting everybody in the room, not thousands of people, but key people from each of those groups, to develop, you know, leagues of extraordinary people to develop that strategic plan framework and start projecting it out into the future. Part of the issue that would address is the fact that one person in a room of 350 had heard of FFICE. It's not a good outlook for the industry in its current state. I know their focus is on different things at the moment, but unless we start looking past this and how we pick up the pieces on the other side, we're going to be doing exactly the same thing as we did on the way into it.
Okay.
An interesting There's an interesting commonality between the issue of TBO and the silos within the airlines, and that is that they both require data sharing. They both require proper visibility to data, certainly for TBO across airlines and across the industry more broadly. And the thing that eliminates the silos within the airlines, between the departments, is the ability to recognize that other departments have got useful information, and to try to find some way to leverage that. Because at the moment we find things, we'll go into an airline and we'll see that there are three different groups of people collecting the same pieces of information. And it just doesn't need to happen that way. So the proper visibility and distribution of information, I think, is one of the most critical things for both the silos and certainly for TBO.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Going to one. Marcus, this one might be for you. You touched on, there was a touch on big data. So how, in your vision, do you see the influence of disruptive technology, AI, ML, blockchain? How do you see that feeding in to this landscape?
I think, we take a step back from all of that. The issue is that blockchain is very interesting and it holds a lot of potential, but it's technology, and our focus is always on systems being developed as information, processes, and technology. And the technology is only made to make the processes more efficient or make the systems more efficient. So while I think blockchain and big data and all the other initiatives that have come before them are very interesting, I think that they over time end up playing more of a big role than they may at first appear to be. The thing is, I've been doing information systems for 30 years, and you see these things come in and they look fantastic, and they are fantastic, but they get overtaken and they get diminished, and other things start replacing parts of them. And so, our focus is more on the clean stuff and less on, how is it going to get done? More on the system level stuff. And I think that's really key, is to not get hung up on, we need to go down the blockchain path, or we need to go down the big data path. And, those sorts of things tend to be very expensive, and I can't count how many times I've seen them go wrong and get thrown out.
Okay. Well, we are now at 8:03. This will conclude our session. Mike, Marcus, thank you very, very much for a fascinating discussion, an excellent presentation.
It was a pleasure. Thanks very much for attending, everyone.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us. And for those whose questions we didn't get to, we'll endeavour to work through them and get back to everybody over the course of the next few days.
Gentlemen, stay happy and stay healthy.
You too.
Take care. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.